November 1983. In command centers across Western Europe, NATO officers began a routine they had practiced before, checking codes, transmitting messages, confirming procedures. On paper, nothing unusual was happening. This was Able Archer 83, a scheduled military exercise, a drill. But this drill was different. For the first time, NATO wasn't just simulating troop movements or defensive responses. Able Archer 83 was designed to rehearse the most sensitive process of all, how a conventional conflict would escalate into a nuclear one, and how that decision would be transmitted, confirmed, and executed through the chain of command. It was a test of control, of discipline, of procedure, and from NATO's point of view, it was working exactly as intended. But hundreds of miles to the east, the same signals were being read very differently. In Moscow and across the Soviet military intelligence network, analysts were watching NATO activity with unusual intensity. The Cold War in 1983 was not calm. It was not stable. It was tense, brittle, and shaped by fear, especially the fear of a surprise nuclear first strike. Soviet doctrine assumed one thing above all else. If a nuclear war ever began, it would begin suddenly. So the Soviets built their warning systems around patterns. Changes in communication, shifts in command behavior, unusual movements of leadership, signals that suggested preparation, not routine. And during Able Archer 83, those signals began to appear. NATO command traffic increased. Message formats changed. The language used in communications mirrored real wartime procedures. Senior officials appear to be involved in ways consistent with escalation scenarios. To NATO, this meant realism. To the Soviets, it meant danger. Because from their perspective, this was exactly how a real nuclear attack would begin, hidden behind the cover of a drill. No missiles were launched. No borders were crossed. No public warnings were issued. But inside the Soviet system, alarms were quietly being raised. The most dangerous aspect of Able Archer 83 wasn't what NATO was doing. It was what NATO didn't know. They didn't know how closely they were being watched. They didn't know how nervous the Soviet leadership already was. And they didn't know that their exercise, meant to ensure control, was being interpreted as a possible countdown to war. In nuclear strategy, perception matters as much as intention, sometimes more. A drill does not have to be real to be deadly. It only has to look real to the other side. As Able Archer unfolded, both superpowers were acting rationally within their own assumptions. NATO believed it was rehearsing safety and coordination. The Soviet Union believed it might be witnessing the final steps before a first strike. And neither side fully understood what the other was thinking. This is the story of how a military exercise, planned, authorized, and executed in peacetime, nearly triggered the most catastrophic misunderstanding of the Cold War. Not because anyone wanted war, but because the system was built to expect it. And once that expectation took hold, even a drill could begin to look like the real thing. By 1983, the Cold War had entered one of its most unstable phases since the early 1960s. This was not a period of détente. It was a moment defined by suspicion, miscalculation, and a growing belief, especially inside the Soviet leadership, that war might not only be possible, but imminent. Earlier decades had taught both sides a brutal lesson. Nuclear war would be unwinnable. But by the early 1980s, that lesson was being reinterpreted. New weapons, faster missiles, and improved command systems created a dangerous illusion that a first strike might be survivable if executed quickly and decisively. From Moscow's perspective, the balance no longer felt stable. The United States had deployed Pershing II missiles in Western Europe. These weapons were fast, accurate, and capable of reaching Soviet command centers in minutes. To Soviet planners, that speed mattered. It compressed decision time to an almost impossible degree. In a nuclear crisis, minutes could determine everything. If a first strike were coming, there would be little warning. And if the warning came too late, there would be no second chance. This fear shaped Soviet thinking in ways that are easy to underestimate today. Soviet intelligence was not simply watching for missiles. It was watching for intent. Analysts were trained to look for patterns that suggested preparation. Changes in leadership behavior, abnormal military coordination, unusual communication flows, or exercises that suddenly became more realistic. The assumption was simple and terrifying. A real attack would be hidden inside something ordinary. A drill, a training exercise, a routine maneuver, because no rational adversary would announce the start of a nuclear war. In 1983, these fears were reinforced by a series of shocks. Earlier that year, Soviet air defenses had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into restricted airspace, killing all 269 people on board. The incident deepened Soviet paranoia about Western surveillance and provocation, while confirming Western views of Soviet rigidity and aggression. Trust, already thin, evaporated further. At the same time, the Soviet economy was stagnating, its leadership aging and uncertain. The Kremlin was deeply sensitive to signs of weakness. Appearing unprepared or slow to react carried its own risks. Inside this environment, the concept of a Western first strike was not fringe thinking. It was mainstream. That belief produced a dangerous doctrine. If warning signs appeared, the Soviet Union could not afford to wait for confirmation. Delay might mean destruction. So the system was designed to react quickly, sometimes faster than certainty would allow. This is what made 1983 uniquely dangerous. Not because war was inevitable, but because the threshold for misinterpretation was extremely low. In calmer years, Able Archer might have passed unnoticed. It was, after all, a NATO exercise held regularly. But in 1983, every assumption was different. Every signal was suspect. Every deviation from routine carried weight. Every ambiguity leaned toward the worst case. NATO planners did not see this full picture. From their side, Able Archer was meant to test coordination under stress. It aimed to ensure that if the unthinkable ever happened, the system would function smoothly and decisively. The exercise emphasized realism precisely because realism was thought to prevent mistakes. But realism cuts both ways. What looked like discipline to one side looked like preparation to the other. And in a world where nuclear weapons sat on hair-trigger alert, perception could move faster than fact. By late 1983, the Cold War was no longer a static standoff. It was a dynamic system under pressure, sensitive to noise, vulnerable to misunderstanding, and dangerously reliant on assumptions about the other side's intentions. This was the environment into which Able Archer 83 was introduced. Not into a stable balance, not into mutual confidence, but into a moment when fear had already primed both sides to expect the worst. And when a system is built around that expectation, it doesn't need proof to escalate. It only needs signals that fit the pattern. In the days leading up to Able Archer 83, warning signs were already appearing. They didn't come as sirens or dramatic alerts. They came as subtle signals, patterns that suggested the Soviet Union was reacting differently than usual to NATO activity. For analysts trained to read intent, these changes mattered. Soviet intelligence units were unusually active. Monitoring increased. Reports became more frequent. Instead of treating Able Archer as another annual exercise, Soviet systems began flagging it as something that deserved closer attention. This was not normal behavior. By early November 1983, Western intelligence had reasons to believe that Moscow was on edge. Analysts noted heightened sensitivity to NATO movements and a tendency to interpret ambiguity as threat. In quieter years, these signs might have triggered caution. In 1983, they blended into the background noise of a tense Cold War. And that was the problem. The warnings existed, but they didn't arrive as a single, undeniable message. They came fragmented, filtered through bureaucratic layers, competing priorities, and assumptions built over decades. One assumption stood above all others. Able Archer was a routine exercise, because it had always been routine. NATO had conducted Able Archer drills before. They were scheduled. They were known. And from NATO's perspective, Nothing suggested that this year would be fundamentally different, except for improvements meant to make the simulation more realistic. That confidence shaped how incoming signals were interpreted. Reports of Soviet nervousness were viewed as expected behavior. After all, the Cold War had always involved monitoring exercises closely. Increased surveillance did not automatically mean imminent danger. What was missing was feedback. NATO had no direct window into how far Soviet concern had escalated. There was no shared dashboard of alert levels. No mechanism to reveal internal threat assessments on the other side. Each bloc operated inside its own information bubble. So when fragments of concern surfaced, they were weighed against years of precedent and dismissed as manageable. There was also institutional momentum. Able Archer was already planned, authorized, and underway. Adjusting or scaling back the exercise would have required a strong justification. And without a clear, unified warning, something unmistakable, there was little incentive to intervene. In complex systems, inertia is powerful. Another factor made intervention even less likely. Realism was seen as a safety feature. NATO planners believed that more realistic drills reduced the risk of mistakes during an actual crisis. Practicing exact procedures, precise communications, and realistic timelines was supposed to prevent confusion later. From that mindset, dialing down realism would have been counterproductive. But realism to one side can look like rehearsal to the other. As Able Archer progressed, Soviet observers noted details that fit their worst-case models. Communication patterns resembled wartime protocols. The exercise simulated escalation, not just defense. And the involvement of senior command structures appeared consistent with preparations for real-world decision-making. These observations didn't trigger panic, but they reinforced suspicion. And suspicion, once reinforced, doesn't require confirmation to grow. What made this moment particularly dangerous was timing. Able Archer unfolded within a narrow window, days, not weeks. Decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information. That compressed timeline left little room for reassessment. Within NATO, the absence of dramatic pushback became reassurance in itself. No crisis hotline was activated. No explicit warnings arrived from Moscow. No unmistakable signal demanded a pause. From NATO's internal perspective, that silence suggested stability. But silence can mean many things. On the Soviet side, restraint did not mean calm. It meant observation, preparation, and readiness. Actions taken quietly, without signaling intent. This created a classic Cold War paradox. Each side interpreted the other's behavior through its own assumptions. NATO assumed the exercise was being seen as routine. The Soviet Union assumed it might be seeing the opening act of something far more dangerous. And because neither assumption was directly challenged, both sides continued forward. The warnings didn't fail because they were false. They failed because they were incomplete, and because no one fully understood how much was at stake. By the time Able Archer reached its most sensitive phases, the window for easy correction had already closed. What remained was escalation driven not by intent, but by interpretation. And in a nuclear standoff, that difference can disappear very quickly. Able Archer 83 officially began in early November 1983, and on the surface, it followed a familiar script. It was a command post exercise. No tanks rolled across borders. No troops maneuvered in the field. Instead, the action took place inside offices, bunkers, and communication rooms, exactly where a real nuclear conflict would be managed. That distinction mattered. Unlike conventional military drills, Able Archer wasn't about movement. It was about decisions. It simulated how a crisis would escalate, how information would flow, and how orders would move from political leadership down to operational forces. And in 1983, NATO decided to make that simulation more realistic than ever before. Previous Able Archer exercises had used simplified procedures. Messages were sometimes marked clearly as exercise traffic. Escalation steps were compressed or abstracted. Senior leaders were often represented rather than directly involved. Able Archer 83 changed that. The exercise introduced new communication formats designed to mirror real wartime messages. Encryption procedures were upgraded. The pace of transmissions increased. The scenario simulated a gradual escalation, from conventional conflict to the threshold of nuclear release, step by step. From NATO's internal perspective, this was progress. Realistic training was seen as essential. If the unthinkable ever happened, there would be no time to learn procedures on the fly. The system had to work under pressure, with realism baked in. But realism carries a cost. To an outside observer, there was no clear line separating rehearsal from preparation. As Able Archer progressed, NATO command traffic began to resemble the early stages of an actual crisis. The exercise tested how orders would be authenticated, how release authority would be transmitted, and how coordination across multiple countries would function under stress. These were not abstract simulations. They mirrored real decision paths. From a Soviet viewpoint, this was alarming. Soviet intelligence was trained to look for exactly these signals, not for dramatic gestures, but for subtle shifts that indicated readiness. Changes in communication patterns. Increased involvement of senior command structures. A move from generic drills to scenario-driven escalation. Able Archer 83 checked too many of those boxes. The exercise also unfolded at a time when Soviet leadership was particularly sensitive to surprise. Their doctrine assumed that any real nuclear attack would be fast, coordinated, and masked until the last moment. A drill provided the perfect cover. As the scenario advanced toward simulated nuclear use, the signals grew more troubling. The exercise didn't just test defensive responses, it practiced the logic of escalation. It explored how a conflict might cross the nuclear threshold and how that transition would be managed. To NATO planners, this was responsible preparation. To Soviet analysts, it looked like rehearsal. What made matters worse was the absence of context. The Soviet Union had no insight into NATO's internal intent. It could not see planning documents or safety assumptions. It could only observe outputs, communications, patterns, and timelines. And those outputs, stripped of context, appear consistent with a system moving toward real-world readiness. At no point did NATO signal that this realism might be misinterpreted. From their perspective, there was nothing to signal. The exercise was defensive, scheduled, and controlled. But in nuclear strategy, meaning is not defined by intent alone. It is defined by how actions are read by the other side. Able Archer 83 crossed a subtle threshold. It moved from being a familiar annual event to something qualitatively different. Not because of a single dramatic change, but because multiple small changes aligned in a way that fit Soviet fears. Each adjustment made sense on its own. Together, they created a dangerous picture. The drill now simulated the very process the Soviet Union feared most: a rapid, coordinated transition from peace to nuclear war, executed with discipline and secrecy. And once that picture formed, it became difficult to ignore. From inside NATO, Able Archer was proceeding smoothly. Procedures were being tested. Communications were functioning. The system appeared stable. From outside, the same stability suggested preparation. This is the central irony of Able Archer 83. The better the exercise functioned, the more dangerous it became. Because efficiency, realism, and discipline are exactly what a real nuclear operation would require. No one crossed a line intentionally. No one issued an aggressive order. No one believed they were provoking a crisis. But the system was doing what it had been designed to do: simulate war as realistically as possible. And in a world already primed for fear, that simulation was enough to blur the boundary between exercise and reality. By the time Able Archer reached its most sensitive phases, the distinction no longer mattered. To one side, this was training. To the other, it looked like the opening moves of something far more final. As Able Archer 83 moved deeper into its scenario, the margin for error narrowed. From the outside, nothing dramatic was visible. There were no public announcements, no emergency broadcasts, No visible mobilization that civilians could see. But inside Soviet command structures, the situation was being reassessed in real time. And that reassessment carried consequences. Within hours of the exercise reaching its escalation phase, Soviet monitoring intensified. This was no longer passive observation. Signals were being compared against worst-case models, templates built around one core assumption. A real nuclear attack would not announce itself. It would look like preparation. It would look like coordination. It would look like control. Able Archer was now producing exactly those signals. Communication patterns matched wartime expectations. The tempo of message traffic suggested urgency. The simulated transition toward nuclear release procedures aligned with Soviet fears about how NATO would initiate a first strike. From Moscow's perspective, this was not proof, but it was enough to justify precautionary steps. And in a nuclear system, precaution itself can be dangerous. By that same day, elements of the Soviet military posture were adjusted. Forces associated with nuclear delivery were placed on higher readiness. This did not mean missiles were launched or final orders issued, but it did mean that the system was moving closer to a state where decisions would have to be made quickly. Time became compressed. In nuclear doctrine, alert status is not just a technical setting. It is a psychological shift. Once forces are placed on higher readiness, every new piece of information carries more weight. The cost of waiting increases. The pressure to interpret ambiguous signals as hostile grows stronger. This is the escalation window, the period when systems begin reacting to each other faster than humans can comfortably reassess. Within this window, actions taken to reduce vulnerability can increase risk instead. From the Soviet side, raising readiness was rational. If NATO were preparing a surprise strike, failing to respond in time would be catastrophic. Preparation was a form of survival. But the logic cuts both ways. If NATO had detected these readiness changes, they might have interpreted them as preparation for an attack. That, in turn, could have triggered countermeasures. Each side, acting defensively, would appear increasingly aggressive to the other. This feedback loop is one of the most dangerous features of nuclear standoffs. During Able Archer 83, that loop came disturbingly close to activating fully. The most critical factor was speed. The exercise unfolded over days, but reactions occurred within hours. Decision cycles shortened. Analysts and commanders had less time to question assumptions. Each report reinforced the same question: what if this is real? And once that question dominates, alternative explanations fade. There was no single moment when the Soviet Union decided war was inevitable. Instead, there was a gradual narrowing of options. As readiness increased, the cost of being wrong rose dramatically. If NATO was bluffing, caution would look unnecessary. If NATO was not bluffing, hesitation would be fatal. This asymmetry pushed decision-makers toward readiness, not restraint. Meanwhile, NATO remained unaware of the scale of this reaction. Inside NATO command centers, Able Archer was proceeding according to plan. Systems were performing well. Communications were efficient. There were no signs of external alarm. That absence of feedback was itself dangerous. Without visible resistance or warnings, NATO had no reason to adjust the exercise. From their perspective, the drill was validating the very thing it was designed to test: control under pressure. But pressure is relative. What felt controlled on one side felt threatening on the other. The escalation window is defined not by missiles, but by misalignment, when two systems operate on different assumptions while responding to the same signals. Able Archer 83 created exactly that condition. On one side, realism was a training tool. On the other, realism was a warning sign. And once readiness levels rise, the system does not reset easily. Every hour that passes reinforces the sense that something is unfolding. Every additional signal is interpreted through an increasingly narrow lens. The most dangerous moments in the Cold War were rarely loud. They were quiet, procedural, administrative. They unfolded through checklists, status updates, and alert postures, steps that looked routine but carried enormous weight. Able Archer 83 entered that zone. not because anyone wanted escalation, but because the system rewarded preparation more than patience. The world did not cross the point of no return during this window, but it moved close enough to reveal how thin the margin truly was. And the closer that margin becomes, the less room there is for doubt, debate, or reversal. At that point, history is no longer shaped by intent. It is shaped by momentum. And during those hours in November 1983, that momentum was pointing in a direction no one could fully control. The most dangerous moment of Able Archer 83 wasn't when alert levels shifted or assumptions hardened. It was the fact that NATO never realized it had triggered those reactions at all. From inside NATO command centers, nothing appeared wrong. The exercise was unfolding smoothly. Communications were clear. Procedures were being followed exactly as designed. There were no emergency messages from Moscow, no diplomatic warnings, no crisis hotline calls. Silence was interpreted as stability. But silence can be deceptive. In nuclear strategy, the absence of response does not always mean calm. Sometimes it means preparation, quiet, internal, and deliberately concealed. And that was precisely what made the situation so dangerous. NATO had no direct visibility into Soviet threat perception. There was no shared mechanism to indicate rising alert levels or internal fear. Each side operated behind its own informational curtain, interpreting the same events through radically different assumptions. To NATO, Able Archer was a controlled environment. To the Soviet Union, it was a puzzle with potentially fatal stakes. This asymmetry created a blind spot. Because NATO planners believed the exercise was routine, they expected routine reactions. Increased Soviet monitoring fit that expectation. Anything short of a dramatic protest or visible mobilization seemed to confirm that the drill was being understood correctly. But the Soviet system did not broadcast panic. Its logic was built around secrecy and speed. If an attack were imminent, revealing fear would only weaken deterrence. So the response was inward, tightening readiness, sharpening analysis, preparing options, all without notifying the other side. This meant that the most critical feedback loop, the one that might have prompted NATO to pause, clarify, or de-escalate, never activated. There was no moment when NATO stopped and asked, "How is this being perceived?" And there was no moment when the Soviet Union felt confident enough to ask, "Is this just a drill?" Each side assumed it already knew the answer. In complex systems, this is where accidents happen. Because decisions are made not in response to reality, but in response to a model of reality. And those models can diverge sharply. NATO's model assumed predictability and routine. The Soviet model assumed deception and surprise. Both models were internally consistent. Both were wrong about the other side. As Able Archer continued, this divergence deepened. NATO focused on execution quality. The Soviets focused on pattern recognition. Each side reinforced its own interpretation with every passing hour, and the gap between them widened. This is why misinterpretation is so dangerous in nuclear standoffs. It doesn't require hostility. It doesn't require aggression. It only requires two systems responding logically to incomplete information. The exercise itself became irrelevant. What mattered was perception. At no point did NATO intend to signal an imminent attack. But intention does not control interpretation. Signals do. And once those signals are read through fear, even neutral actions can take on threatening meaning. The most sobering lesson of Able Archer 83 is not how close the world came to disaster. It's how easily that proximity went unnoticed. No alarms sounded in NATO headquarters. No emergency meetings were called. No one realized that the other side was quietly bracing for the worst. If escalation had occurred, it would not have been preceded by a dramatic breakdown. It would have emerged from this silence, from the absence of shared awareness. This is what made Able Archer nearly catastrophic. Not a reckless decision, not an aggressive order, but a failure of mutual perception. When systems built for speed and secrecy collide, misunderstanding can travel faster than intent. And in November 1983, That misunderstanding came close enough to matter. The world did not know it was in danger, which is often when it is most at risk. Able Archer 83 did not end with a decision. It ended with a deadline. The exercise concluded on schedule, just as it was designed to. Messages returned to normal formats. Simulated escalation stopped. Command traffic slowed. The signals that had caused concern began to fade. And with that, the moment passed. No missiles were launched. No emergency orders were issued. No irreversible step was taken. But what stopped escalation was not a safeguard built into the system. It was hesitation. Inside the Soviet leadership, doubts began to surface. As the exercise drew to a close without any real-world strike, the assumption of an imminent attack weakened. The feared final step never arrived. What had looked like preparation now appeared, gradually, to be something else. That shift mattered. In nuclear command systems, restraint often does not come from certainty. It comes from uncertainty, from the inability to fully commit to the worst-case interpretation when reality refuses to confirm it. There was no single moment when the Soviet Union decided, this is only a drill. Instead, there was a slow release of pressure. Readiness remained elevated, but the sense of urgency diminished. The window for immediate action closed. This is a critical detail. If Able Archer had lasted longer, if the scenario had escalated one step further, if one additional signal had reinforced the worst fears, the outcome might have been different. What saved the situation was timing, not design. Able Archer ended before assumptions hardened into decisions, before momentum overpowered doubt, before fear crossed the threshold where restraint became impossible. This is why historians often describe the event as a near miss rather than a narrowly avoided launch. The system did not stop itself. It simply ran out of time, and that distinction matters. Nuclear command and control systems are often portrayed as precise, layered with safeguards and fail-safes. Able Archer 83 revealed something far less reassuring. When misinterpretation takes hold, those systems rely heavily on human judgment. Judgment under pressure. Judgment with incomplete information. Judgment shaped by fear. The Soviet decision-makers who hesitated were not heroes in a dramatic sense. They did not defy orders or issue bold commands. They simply did not act decisively enough to cross the final line. That hesitation, quiet, uncelebrated, and largely invisible at the time, was enough. On the NATO side, there was no moment of realization. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. From their perspective, the exercise concluded successfully. Objectives were met. Procedures were validated. The danger passed unnoticed. This asymmetry defines Able Archer's legacy. One side stepped back from a perceived edge. The other never knew the edge existed. If escalation had occurred, post-war analysis would likely have framed it as a tragic misunderstanding. But in November 1983, that analysis never happened because the catastrophe never materialized. Instead, the event slipped into obscurity, known only to a small circle of analysts and officials. For years, Able Archer 83 was remembered as just another Cold War exercise. Only later would it become clear how close the system had come to testing its ultimate failure mode. What stopped it was not policy, not communication, not foresight. It was delay. And delay, in a nuclear standoff, is not something that can be reliably engineered. It is something that happens, or doesn't. In this case, it happened, just long enough for the moment to pass. For years after November 1983, almost no one talked about Able Archer 83. There were no headlines, no public acknowledgments, no official admissions that anything had gone wrong. From the outside, it looked like a non-event. Only much later, through declassified documents, retrospective studies, and Cold War archives, did the real picture begin to emerge. What had once been labeled a routine NATO exercise was quietly reclassified in historical memory as something far more dangerous. A near miss. The irony is hard to ignore. Able Archer 83 was designed to ensure control, to prevent confusion, to make nuclear command and control safer by rehearsing it under realistic conditions. Instead, it exposed the system's most fragile weakness. Not technology, not weapons, but perception. The same realism meant to reduce risk nearly magnified it, because realism does not exist in isolation. It exists in the mind of the observer. And in 1983, that observer was already conditioned to expect the worst. The lesson of Able Archer is not that military exercises are reckless. It is that interpretation cannot be controlled. A system built on deterrence assumes rational actors with shared assumptions. But the Cold War proved that assumptions are rarely shared, and that rational behavior can look radically different depending on fear, history, and timing. No one intended to provoke a crisis in November 1983. No one planned to bring the world to the edge. No one issued a reckless or aggressive order. And yet the system moved there anyway, because nuclear stability depends on fragile expectations, and those expectations can collapse quietly. Able Archer 83 showed how close the world could come to catastrophe without ever realizing it was in danger. There was no dramatic confrontation, no emergency broadcast, no leaders addressing the public. There was only procedure and silence and a narrowing window of interpretation. What ultimately prevented disaster was not a safeguard written into doctrine. It was human hesitation, doubt that slowed decisions just enough for reality to catch up with fear. That is not a comforting conclusion, because hesitation cannot be programmed. The Cold War ended without a nuclear exchange, not because the system was perfect, but because it survived its own flaws long enough for history to change. Able Archer 83 reminds us that the most dangerous moments are often invisible. They do not announce themselves. They pass quietly until documents are opened decades later and we realize how close the margin truly was. And this wasn't the only time the Cold War nearly turned hot without a single shot being fired. In the next episode, we'll return to a frozen checkpoint in the heart of Berlin, where American and Soviet tanks faced each other at point-blank range, engines running, crews waiting for orders, until one quiet command stopped everything. Was it restraint or sheer luck that prevented disaster that day? Let me know in the comments which Cold War near-miss you think came closest to catastrophe. And don't forget to subscribe to Cold War Command so you don't miss the next chapter in this ongoing series of decisions that nearly changed history forever.